Welcome to our lesson on the perfect participle in Greek. The first thing we want to say is that the perfect participle is less common than the continuous or present participle and the undefined or the aorist participle. And the middle passive forms for this participle are actually more common than the active forms, and that's a little different. So let's first take a look at the middle passive forms. If we take a quick glance at all of these, we can see that it keeps the reduplication, and it forms with the familiar participle morpheme for the middle passive voice, mena and mene. So it keeps the reduplication, and just as we saw for the perfect tense and the indicative, there's no connecting vowel in the middle passive voice. So we have the reduplication, then we have the stem, and then we have the participle morpheme plus the case endings. In the aspect of the perfect participle, it's similar to the undefined in the sense that the action of the participle is anterior to the timing of the main verb that it will kind of be attached to, or it will be sidekicking in the broader context. So the action for these perfect participles is going to be past, and just as we saw with the indicative verb, they will have continuous results. So the idea is past action, continuous results. If the participle does not have an article, it's probably functioning more adverbially. And that means that it's going to be a little more connected to the verb. It's modifying the verb a little more than it's modifying a particular noun or pronoun in the context. It doesn't mean that it's not modifying a noun or pronoun. It just means it's a little more tightly connected to the verb. Now, I will say that sometimes when it's functioning adjectively, there'll also not be an article. But generally, when it doesn't have the article, it's functioning adverbially. If it does have an article, then we're going to translate these participles a little more like an adjective, and this is something that we've seen in the previous videos. So the translation for these would be having been, and then the past participle form of whatever the verbal stem means. So if these forms from lu, and so that's loose, having been loosed. Now sometimes the past participle does not have the ed. For instance, if the verb was throw, it would be having been thrown. But generally the suffix is ed, and that would be a good translation for whatever perfect middle passive participle we come across. And we're assuming with putting the helping verb been that this is a passive. We will also see a few that are maybe more middle or deponent, and those will be translated actively, but here we're assuming a passive translation. Having been loosed. So the way they form again is with a reduplication, and then the stem, and then comes the participle morpheme, mena or mene, and then the case endings. For a lot of the participles that we've studied, they are third declension because of that participle morpheme, nu tau. But these are going to be first and second declension, just as you can see up where it says masculine, feminine, and neuter. They follow a 2-1-2 pattern, which means that they will take those case endings that we learned early on in the year. So when one of these participles is functioning more adverbially, what are some rules we need to keep in mind for the translation, for a verbal translation? Well, keep in mind that if there's no article, generally that means it's functioning more adverbially. And it will be accompanying a main or formal verb in the context. Generally that verb will be indicative. And the past participle form of the verb plus having been generally makes for a good translation, just as we talked about. So let's take a look at some examples. This would be translated, you yourselves are full of goodness. Este would be a form of eimi, and then agathosunes is goodness, full of goodness, and then comes a perfect middle passive participle from plerao, pe pleromenoi, having been filled with all knowledge. You yourselves are full of goodness, having been filled with all knowledge. Now some translations might opt for just the word filled, and that would be fine, but we're keeping the having been to show a little more clearly or more fully what is the aspect, the idea of the perfect participle. Maybe you didn't notice, but in this example we've got a form of eimi, which is este, which is translated you or you all, and that actually accompanies the pepleromene. In fact, pepleromene wouldn't make a lot of sense if it just appeared by itself without that form of eimi. So the idea is, you yourselves are, having been filled with all knowledge. This happens a lot. It's a very common construction. The perfect participle with a form of a me. And as English speakers, basically what we have to grapple with is how we should translate this. For instance, you have been filled versus, well, if we think, okay, well, a me means you are, and then the participle itself means having been filled. Would we actually want to put in the translation, you are having been filled? That's a mouthful for an English speaker. And the answer is no, generally you don't want to do that. I mean, maybe if we wanted to be very literal, we could write it out that way to help us remember what is the aspect of the participle. But that kind of translation would never make its way into an official translation just because it's such a mouthful. Another good translation, we've translated it here, having been filled, up above. You yourselves are full of goodness, having been filled with all knowledge, and that's fine. But another fine translation would just be to put you are filled. So we could replace the having been filled with filled, and that would be okay. But one thing that we want to keep in mind is it does have more of a perfective aspect, this idea of a past action with continuing results. And that is the benefit of having included in our translation having been filled here. So these are some of the nitty-gritty points, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the me plus the perfect participle because, like I said, it does happen a lot. So if there's a construction where we have a present form of me, I don't know if you'll remember the paradigm, but we've got me, estin, esmen, este, and isin. Well, if there's a present form of me like that with a perfect participle, the basic tense, the basic translation would just be as a perfect tense verb, and the translation would be, let's just say it's third person singular. He has been loosed. That's the translation of a perfect verb. And practically speaking, this construction is a perfect construction, has been loosed. Sometimes we'll see the imperfect form of me plus the perfect participle, and the tense that's indicated by that would be the pluperfect. And that's the grammatical description of, well, instead of has, had. Because it's a perfect action, but it happened in the past. So instead of he has been loosed, now it's he had been loosed, and it's a reference to the past. If we have a future form of me plus the perfect participle, this would be the future perfect tense, and the translation would be he will have been loosed. And we can take a look at examples of each one of these, might help concrete these concepts in our minds. For by grace you have been saved through faith. Este is the form of me that appears with sesos menoi, which is a perfect middle passive participle from sozo. You have been saved. We just translated it as a perfect passive indicative in this verse. And here's an example of the pluperfect. Because John still, and then we've got ein beblemenos, that's from balo, which means I cast. Because John still had not been cast in prison. Again, it's a reference to the past. And it's pluperfect. And here's a really interesting example of a future perfect. And this is when Jesus was promising his disciples that they would have authority as when they would form as a church. And he said, whatever you loose upon the earth, and here comes the periphrastic construction. That's what these are called. When a form of me appears with a perfect participle, periphrastic construction. Estai lelumenon. Estai is a future form of me. Lelumenon, we should be able to identify. It's got that reduplication. It's got the mena, participle morpheme. So it's from loose, will have been loosed in heaven. In some translations, it's a little harder to see that this is a future perfect, and the translation is given, whatever you loose upon the earth will be loosed in heaven. But when we keep the future perfect aspect, will have been loosed, it really centers the authority more in heaven and more in God than it does in man. And knowing that helps us avoid these papal type of arguments where the idea is that the Pope or any particular leader in church has the authority to make celestial decrees, when in reality only God can do that. So let's take a look at the adjectival translation. When these participles are attached a little more to the nouns, they can function attributively or substantively. They can stand alone, in other words. When they function this way, they prefer the article, but they don't require it, as I already mentioned. In other words, when there's no article, generally it's adverbial, but sometimes it will be more adjectival. And they will be modifying another noun or pronoun in the context with which that participle agrees in case, number, and gender. And some form of having is often appropriate for translation. So here's an example of the perfect participle, an active form, modifying the word that means man. Tu andros tu leluketos. So we translate this, of the man, we'll keep that key word for the genitive case, who has loosed. And just as we've seen with other participle constructions, we often need to provide a relative pronoun in the translation for it to make the most sense. Here's an example from the scriptures. So is pas ha gegenemenos ek tu numathos. So is everyone from pas ha gegenemenos, who has been born from the Spirit. So gegenemenos is masculine nominative singular, and that corresponds to pas, which is the same, and they're working together here. Now when it's functioning substantively, it will appear alone. And when it does this, the key word for the cases is normally preserved. In other words, if it appears as a genitive, generally we keep the key word of. Or if it's dative, generally we'll keep the key word to, or for, or with. So if it was appearing all by itself as tu lelukotos, we might translate it, of the one who has loosed. Here's an example of the nominative case. So in this case there is no key word that we'll keep, but this would be translated, those who have been called were not worthy. So what's the subject of the sentence here? It's actually the participle, hoi keklemenoi, and there's no other noun or pronoun that appears with it. It's standing alone. And so it would be translated, those who have been called were not worthy. And notice in our translation how we've kept that key word helping verb have, which helps us understand that it's more of a perfective aspect. Here are the forms of the active perfect participles. Notice that they keep reduplication, we're used to seeing that, and that the tense morpheme is kappa and not kappa alpha. The participle morpheme here is a little different. It's not nu tau, it's actually omicron tau. And we can understand why that would happen, because nu tau does not easily follow kappa. So it's not couldn't, it's, for example, if it's genitive singular, lelukatos instead of lelukuntos, something like that. So it's omicron tau. And in the feminine, it takes wia as the participle morpheme. The patterns of formation are explained in earlier lessons. So if you're asking yourself, for instance, why the nominative singular looks kind of funny or the dative plural, it's because they're third declension, and that has been explained in the previous participle lessons. All of these could be translated having loosed if they were adverbial. So a good adverbial translation for lelukos, if it appeared with esosen, would be having loosed, he saved. Or the attributive, tu andros tu lelukotos, of the man who has loosed. And the substantive, again, would appear by itself, and a good translation would be of the one who has loosed. The last thing we need to talk about in this lesson is what is the genitive absolute. This is when a participle appears with a noun or a pronoun in the genitive case. So both will be in the genitive case, and usually there's no grammatical connection to the rest of the sentence. Now there is a connection in the sense that it gives us a fuller picture of what was going on at the time, but grammatically the sentence can stand alone without the genitive absolute construction. So when we see a continuous participle, we'll often want to include the key words when or while. If it's indefinite, after, or if it's perfect, after having. An example of the genitive absolute appears in one of the Gospels, and it says, and immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas appeared. So if we cut out the genitive absolute construction, and immediately Judas appeared, it still makes grammatical sense. But of course we want to know when or how this happened, and so a genitive absolute is provided. And instead of trying to figure out, like, put in a key word of there somewhere, no, if it's genitive absolute you won't do that. And you want to remember to include one of these key words, when or while, if it's continuous, which we've done here. If it's indefinite or perfect, there will be other key words that will help us make sense of that construction.